this mic'd up? Can everyone hear? Yeah, this is great. Marcelo, we good? Cool, nice. Thank you everybody for coming. My name is Michael Bodansky. And just as a bit of intro to sort of gauge who's here and what people know and what people don't know, can I just get a show of hands if you're from the UK, if you're British? OK, great. Show of hands if you're American. OK, great. Show of hands if you're American but wish you were British. Anyone? No? OK. Just checking. I mean, there's always a few, right? That normally works. Anyone from like the EU who's not from the UK? Yeah? OK, interesting. So this will be good. And one other thing, actually. If you could put your hand, so a couple more questions. If you could put your hand up if you feel that you know a lot about Brexit. Put your hand up if you know bits, but maybe not a huge amount in depth. OK, great. And if you could put your hand up if you know a bit about behavioral psychology. A few people. OK, so hopefully I will gauge this at a level where if you know everything to do with Brexit and you follow UK politics inside out, and you know everything to do with behavioral psychology, then hopefully it will still be interesting and entertaining. And you can pick me up on all the things that I get wrong. If you don't know anything about anything, hopefully you'll learn something too, and I will try to also be entertaining and titillating in equal measure. Right, so my name is Michael. I work at a PR agency, actually, called Freud's. It's a large PR agency in the UK. It was founded in 1985. It's been going for a long time. And the interesting thing about Freud's, this PR agency, is that the guy who started it is a really interesting guy. He's called Matthew Freud. He's very well known in the UK. There's a large Freud family, a sort of like dynasty in the UK. If anyone knows Lucian Freud, he was a very famous painter. People say he was one of the best painters of the last century. It's all part of the same family. And Sigmund Freud was the great grandfather of our chairman who founded the company. So psychology is in the lifeblood of what we do in our PR agency. And actually, interestingly, there's another guy who some people who know about the history of PR and marketing might know about, a guy called Edward Bernays. So he was also part of the same family, and he was the first guy to take science and psychology and apply it to marketing. And he wrote a lot of the original literature in the late 19th century about propaganda and how to market to populations and how governments can communicate to their populations. So psychology is in the sort of lifeblood of what I do day to day, but I also follow UK politics very, very closely. And I'm going to be talking about Brexit mainly this morning, but I hope you will anticipate that there's a lot of things that I'm going to say that can be used as a case study to talk about Trump and everything that's happened in US politics in the last year, but also all the other factors that are going on with populist politics around the world, not least in other countries across the EU. I actually think there's the Dutch elections today. There's European elections this year, and there's French elections this year. So it's a very busy time for European politics in particular. So Brexit will sort of be a case study of some of the behavioral psychology principles that I'm going to talk about. So a little bit of overview. I'm going to do a crash course in how Brexit happened in about 2 minutes. So Brexit in a nutshell. So in 1973, the UK joined something called the European Communities. This was before the European Union was a thing. And it was preceded by this group called European Communities. And the UK voted overwhelmingly to join the European Communities for lots of different reasons, for economic reasons and political reasons. And it was all going fine and dandy for the next few decades. But there was always a strand of what people call Euroscepticism in the Conservative Party, in the Tory party in the UK. There was always a group of people who felt skeptical about being in Europe, felt that it wasn't working hard enough, and that actually Europe got more from the UK than the UK got from Europe. And that has especially come to a head in the last 5 to 10 years. Separately to that, there has been a general trend in people feeling nervous or concerned about the level of migration to the UK. And this is being felt all across Europe. So not just Syrian refugees coming across and trying to make it through to North Africa, to Libya, trying to get across to Italy, and then trying to come into Europe. But also Eastern European migrants, often economic migrants from Poland and Romania, coming to the UK to seek a better life. And people in different pockets of the UK felt that they were losing out on opportunities due to these migrants. And for a long time, it was a very taboo topic, as it is in lots of societies around the world. It's very difficult to say, we don't like foreign people. But that is the sentiment that came out of lots of focus groups I'm polling over the last decade. Separately to that, a political party in the UK called UKIP, the United Kingdom Independence Party, gained force and traction in about the last 5 years. And there was a very bombastic character in the name of Nigel Farage with awful teeth. So he ticks every British stereotype you can imagine. And he started building a grassroots campaign of people saying openly that it's okay and even advisable to try to get the UK out of the European Union. And he built up a very, very strong grassroots campaign. The combination of all these factors, from Euroscepticism in the Conservative Party, combined with concerns about migration, combined with a feeling that Europe is getting more out of this deal, so things like the Greek economy doing very badly, and the euro doing very badly in different countries across Europe, led to pressure on David Cameron, the Prime Minister since 2010, no longer, led to pressure on him to hold a referendum on the EU. Now, a lot of people said this was an awful idea and he should not countenance it for a second because he had a lot of close advisors that said this is not a good idea and it could potentially backfire. But for lots of different reasons, and in order to address the political pressure that was being pushed upon him, he announced in around 2013 that if the Conservative Party won the election in 2015, then he would hold an in-out referendum on the EU. What they didn't expect when they were going into the 2015 election was that the Conservative Party would do so well. They won a landslide victory, and they did very, very well. And, of course, they had to honor that manifesto pledge. They had to honor their promise that there was going to be an in-out referendum. But before that, David Cameron had a sort of trick up his sleeve that he had arranged with all the other people in government and with the politicians across the EU that before there was going to be a referendum, he could renegotiate Britain's relationship with the European Union. And he could say, well, we could have a referendum, or we could actually have this slightly better deal than we currently have. And he spent a very busy few months towards the end of sort of October 2015 to the beginning of 2016, ferrying all across Europe, going in and out of Brussels, meeting all the European politicians and trying to forge a deal that was with Europe that was better, or that was felt that was better than what the UK already had. However, a lot of people felt that the deal that he got, the renegotiation that he got, was not up to scratch and was not good enough, and the referendum would have to go ahead. The referendum took place on the 23rd of June last summer, and I'm sure you will know by now that the Leave campaign, the campaign to leave the European Union, succeeded against a lot of opinion polls and against a lot of what supposed experts had predicted, and now we are on the route to leaving the European Union. And actually, in the last few weeks, there was speculation that Article 50, which is the treaty that triggers the beginning of the 2-year process to leave the European Union, was going to be announced today. And so it was actually going to be very fortuitous timing. But if anyone is closely following UK politics, you might know that Scotland announced earlier this week that they were going to try to have a second referendum on whether or not Scotland would stay in the EU. And that sort of threw a spanner into the works. And so they said, OK, no, we need to delay. We'll do it at the end of March rather than in the middle. OK, so that's how we got to Brexit in a nutshell. So a lot of Euroscepticism, concern about migration and economic migrants, and also the rise of UKIP and pressure on the Conservative Party to address this issue. It kind of backfired because people felt that George Osborne, the Chancellor, and David Cameron never really thought that we would end up leaving, but we did. So I really like political cartoons. So this is Theresa May, our current Prime Minister, and you can see she's been let out of her straitjacket, which I think is a little bit unfair. But I think It was interesting. When I actually submitted this talk to panel picker to South by last summer, I thought, well, I know that we're going to be having the referendum, but David Cameron had said that if we voted to leave, then he would trigger Article 50 straight away. So I thought by March 2017, it's all going to be old news and it's not going to be relevant anymore. But actually, because Article 50 has been delayed, and also it now post-Trump, and the rise of populism across the EU, it's actually a very, very good time to think about this topic. So I'm going to look at 7 principles of behavioral psychology, and I'm going to see if we can learn anything from what's been happening with the rise up to Brexit, and what's been happening in other political referenda across the world, and see if we can figure out anything new. I'll just say a couple of words on behavioral psychology. So earlier I talked about psychology in general, so the sort of legacy of Sigmund Freud. In the last decade or so, there's been a rise in a new-ish field that some people call behavioral economics, some people call behavioral psychology, and it's a way of trying to rethink behavior change and economics. And the principle behind it is that a lot of economic models have lots of assumptions about how people behave. You might think that if you drop the price of something, then people will want more of it. You might think that people want to take the shortest route to work. You might have lots of assumptions about how people behave in a very strict traditional economic model. But the teaching of behavioral psychology is that we can look at people's behavior and realize that we have all sorts of inbuilt biases in our heads, in our psyche, in our mentality, and our psychological makeup. And we have lots of heuristics, which are rules of thumb that we use for decision making. And we don't necessarily always do what's rational. We might behave irrationally in a predictable way, but we don't necessarily always act rationally. And behavioral psychology advocates certain principles or ways of thinking, or ways of approaching problems. And I'm going to use 7 of them to try to understand Brexit. So the first thing that I'd like to talk about is hindsight bias. So this is the idea that we post-rationalize a lot. We are storytelling creatures. We need to tell stories in order to make sense of who we are and what we're doing and our purpose in the world. And no matter how unusual and complex and confusing our lives are, we almost need to tell a narrative about where we're going and who we are and our place in the world. You often hear when people have, for example, been through a messy divorce, people looking back might say, oh, well, it was all for the best because then it actually led me to something else. Or I got fired from my job, and then it was actually for the best because something else happened. People post-rationalize, and we like to tell stories. But this is a bias because that's the understanding that we are layering over the reality of the events. And the reason that I think we should first look at hindsight bias to understand Brexit is because looking back now, it really seemed like it was a very close call. The Leave campaign got just over half the votes. The Remain campaign got just under half the votes. By the way, you can see that there was a huge turnout, very, very strong turnout across the country. I think it was about 33.5 million people voted, a very strong turnout. And looking back, we might say, oh, it was a close call. And so maybe it could have gone for Leave, maybe it could have gone for Remain. It was 50-50. It was on a knife edge. It was a knife edge vote. But that was certainly not the way that it was seen internally from each of the campaign's headquarters in the year or two building up to it. A lot of people thought that Remain had all the cards, and the Leave campaign was severely disadvantaged. The Remain campaign, just to rattle through some of the advantages that the Remain campaign had, first of all, they had the status quo, which I'll talk about a bit later, very, very powerful. If you have the status quo on your side, then you have people thinking that what they already have might be better than a leap into the unknown. And that was used very effectively in the Scottish referendum campaign, that the message of Scotland should stay in the UK was, well, the status quo is very good, and we know that Scotland being in the UK works. Why would you risk the status quo? Why would you jump into the unknown and risk something that could be good, but it could be bad? So the Remain campaign had the status quo on their side. We were already in the European Union. The Remain campaign had huge manpower. They had access to thousands of civil servants. They had access to all of Whitehall. They had access to our civil service. They had access to thousands of press officers. They also had control of the timing. The Remain campaign had control of the timing of when the referendum would be fixed. And so they could use the timing to their advantage and try to keep the Leave campaign in the dark and catch them off guard. The Remain campaign also, importantly, because David Cameron was fronting the Remain campaign and he was in government, he had control of the cabinet, which is all the ministers, all the politicians in power. So if anyone tried to defect and go to the Leave campaign, he could say, well, you better not do that because your career is going nowhere if you abandon me. And he could threaten and bribe and cajole people with positions of authority and power in order to keep people on his side. So all the odds, well, lots of the odds were stacked for the Remain side, but it actually ended up on the Leave side. So it's worth remembering that it didn't look like 50-50 all the way along. There was a big swing towards the end, towards Leave, which I'll talk about a little bit later. So next we have System 1 and System 2. This is really interesting. So one of the sort of foundational texts of behavioral psychology and behavioral economics is a fantastic book, which I recommend to everybody, called Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. And that sort of rocked the academic world because Daniel Kahneman was a psychologist who was awarded the Nobel Prize in economics. People started saying, how could you give a psychologist a Nobel Prize in economics? They're two completely unrelated fields. And he was the first person to start to stitch these two fields together. And in his book, Thinking Fast and Slow, he characterizes two different ways of thinking. System 1 is our fast and conscious, automatic thinking processes. We use them for most of our day-to-day decisions. If I ask you to complete the phrase black and, you just know it's black and white. You don't need to think what's the opposite to black. That's a System 1 thinking process. If someone shouts stop when you're walking along, your instincts will be to stop before you actually think, why am I stopping? What am I doing? That's System 1. System 2 is the slower, more deliberative, more effortful decision-making process. And if I ask anyone in the audience, how many letter E's are on the slide, you need to sit forward, you need to really engage, you need to think about it. And that sort of thinking process would tap into your System 2 thinking. And so what I want to ask is, can we use the System 1 and the System 2 approaches to thinking to apply that to politics and to Brexit? Well, I think we can. This is Boris Johnson, who's now our foreign minister, with his floppy blonde hair, on the campaign trail. And they had a very good, in my opinion, they had a very good System 1 message. It was, let's take back control. It did very, very well in the focus groups and in all the polling. The take is very active and pushes people towards action and making a decision. On the other hand, on the right-hand side, we have ex-Chancellor George Osborne, who was David Cameron's right-hand man. And he came out with a paper, with a study, a few months before the referendum, where they spent a long time and a lot of effort trying to calculate how much worse off the average British family would be if we voted to leave the European Union. And they came up with this figure, £4,300 a year. And I think that was very much a System 2 message. I think in order to understand what £4,300 a year means to your family finances, you need to really think about how much money you have, what your budget is, what you're spending your money on. It might be correct and it might be important, but it's System 2. It doesn't ram home like a System 1 message. And by the way, on the point of Trump, who I actually think Boris Johnson looks a little bit like in his photo, I think Make America Great Again is a great System 1 message. By the way, the red as well, I think that's a System 1 color as well. And there's lots of interesting psychological studies into the effects of color on noticing things. And taxi firms have painted their cars different colors, and road, highway researchers have painted stop signs different colors. And I think that's a good reason why stop is usually red. Also, a stop sign is red traffic light stop sign is red as well. It's very arresting, and it hits you like a System 1 message. The next is loss aversion. One of the other very interesting findings about our attitudes to winning and losing things that behavioral psychology found through lots of different experiments, mainly through gambling experiments, was that we hate losing almost twice as much as we enjoy winning. Our pleasure from gain is about half as much as the pain that we encounter from losing. There are lots of studies where people are given coins to toss, to flip a coin, and people are given different sets of money that they could win if the coin lands on one side or the other. And people are very likely to take a bet where they will flip a coin and they could win something. They will do that. But people are much less likely to take a second bet where you might actually win more, but on a heads, but on a tails, you would lose even more as well. So high risk, high reward. So we really hate losing. And I think that this bias was employed, whether consciously or subconsciously, by both the in and the out campaigns, because the in campaign came up with a really interesting political message, and they said, we are in the European Union. We don't want to lose out. If you leave, if you vote to leave, you will be worse off. Your family will lose money. You will lose autonomy. The economy will do much worse. And they try to employ loss aversion to their advantage. But I think that the Leave campaign used it much better. And they used loss aversion in the context of a life decision, which was that they said, this is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. The last time there was a decision to leave or join the European Union was in the 1970s, as I said at the beginning. Now we're in the 2010s. It's quite conceivable that if you don't vote to leave now, it's never going to happen again in your lifetime. It might be another 40 or 50 or 60 years before this opportunity comes around again. Act now, otherwise you're going to lose out. And bearing in mind that a lot of the people who voted for Brexit to leave were disproportionately older, were in their 50s and 60s, that really portrays it as a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. If you're 21, you might conceivably think, oh, maybe when I have grandkids, I might get to vote to rejoin again. But if you're an older voter, certainly this is last chance saloon. This is my only chance to take back control and make sure that we have the independence that we really want. This is Michael Gove doing a very unusual handshake. He was videoed doing this at a conference, and someone looped it into a GIF. And yeah, I think this sort of shows that he should not be let out of the house ever. He was on a political interview with, I think it was a BBC journalist, in the run-up to the campaign. It's really hard to look away from those hands, isn't it? I mean, it's really sort of just focuses your vision. Like, what is he doing? So he was in an interview with a political journalist, and as an aside, he used the phrase, "We've had enough of experts. The UK has had enough of experts." And then he moved on to say something else. And that little soundbite was picked up and debated almost ad infinitum in the campaign, whether it was just a sort of glib remark that he threw out without thinking about, or whether he was actually putting his finger on something very real that a lot of people in the UK, and you could also argue in the States and in the European Union and all across the West feel, which is that we're fed up of being told what to do by people who think they know better, and actually they don't really know any better than someone just a monkey throwing a dart randomly at a dartboard. The In campaign wheeled out everyone from Obama, who came to the UK to help campaign, to the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, to the World Bank, and wheeled out all these experts. And people said, well, after 2008, after the financial crash, how can we actually believe anything you say anymore? It might be one thing to believe in the expertise of your doctor, but how can we believe in the expertise of politicians and economists? And I think this is one of the issues in populist politics at the moment. There is an erosion of trust in our politicians. And I think this is something that we really need to address. And I think that if you just translate Michael Gove's statement, "We've had enough of experts," into behavioral psychology, it comes out as system 1 has had enough of system 2. The system 1, which is my internal instinct, what do I feel I should do, has had enough of the rational economists and the people who are using very complex spreadsheets and forecasting tools to say, well, actually, you should weigh it up, and if you vote this side, you'll win a little, you'll gain a little bit of money, and if you vote the other side, you'll lose a little bit of money, and so you should actually weigh it up very rationally. I think people said, no, I've had enough. I'm just going to listen to my own inner instinct. The next is, I'd like to talk a bit about game theory. Behavioral psychology has used a lot of principles from game theory in trying to understand why people make certain decisions. Game theory particularly because game theory is the application of economics in real life. And there are lots of really interesting experiments. The most famous one is the prisoner dilemma that some people might be aware of. A lot of interesting experiments into how you might treat other people if they are being asked to do a certain thing. So we can do this right here. We'll do a little example. If I could just have the names of 2 people in the front row. Stefan? Hilda? Stefan and Hilda. OK. So I have a briefcase with, this is called the ultimatum game, Stefan and Hilda. I have a briefcase with, let's say, $100 in. OK? And I put Stefan and Hilda into a room. And I say, Stefan, I'm going to give you the money. I'm going to give you the briefcase. But either of you can only leave the room with any of the money if you both agree how to split it. You can agree how to split it however you like, but you both need to agree. And if either of you says no, then neither of you get to keep anything. Right? OK, so Stefan starts off with the briefcase. So Stefan turns to Hilda, and he says, well, this is really easy. I have all the money, and you have nothing. So I'll give you $1. Take it or leave it, right? So Hilda is probably quite a bit put out by that, right? Because you think that's very unfair, right? Why should you get $99? A song lyric, $99. Why should you get $99 and I only get $1? So you might say, actually, I'm going to reject that. I'm not going to do it. So Stefan says, hang on a minute. This doesn't make any sense, OK? At the moment, you have 0, and I have all the money. I'm giving you something for nothing, right? I could choose to walk out of here with nothing at all, and you could also walk out with nothing at all. So I'm giving you $1 more than you would have, which would otherwise be 0. But Hilda is offended by that and says, no, I'm embarrassed. You're mocking me. I'm not going to take it. So Stefan says, OK, maybe we'll do $10.90. And Hilda says, no, that's still quite low. And you barter and you negotiate. And in a lot of experiments, the point where people usually agree comes to around 70-30 or 60-40. Occasionally, it goes to 50-50, that if you have a very fair person, look, I'm sure Stefan is, you'll just say, OK, you know what, 50-50, we'll both take half, right? And you both shake hands and you leave the room. But Stefan might conceivably think, hang on, I'm starting off with all the money. I don't need to give her anything if I don't want to. So I'll just give her a small amount and just make sure that I'm still advantaged. So the game theory thinking for Stefan is give her as much as you can get away with. Give her as much as you can to get her to say yes, but as little as you can in order for you to keep as much as possible, right? So how does this actually apply to politics? What am I talking about? This is all theory, right? How does it apply to real life? Well, my theory is that this exact game that I just explained with the briefcase and the $100 is a microcosm of what the exact mentality was for millions of people across the UK towards the politicians, okay? The argument from politicians, the perceived elite, or metropolitan elite, or the man, or the 1%, or the establishment, whatever you want to call them, the people who are the haves, were perceived by the have-nots to have the briefcase. They were the ones with all the money. And the people who didn't have anything said, well, you are offering us such pittance, such small amounts, that actually we would rather say no to spite you, even if it means spiting ourselves, right? So the argument from George Osborne and all his friends was, you need to vote to stay in, otherwise you'll be £4,300 a year worse off, and the economy will crash. Well, hang on a second. Who is most disadvantaged when economies do badly? It's the people at the very bottom. It's the poor working class. They're the people who don't have savings. They suffer the most when there's budget cuts. They suffer when there's cuts to funding to kids and school fees. So the people at the very bottom are the people to whom it matters the most that the economy is doing well. The people at the top, they'll get by. They'll divert their investment portfolio. They'll make amends. They have a fund for a rainy day. The people at the bottom, they're the ones who should care about the economy tanking. But the people at the bottom felt, I would rather feel like I'm screwing over this 1%, even if it means spiting myself, right? And that led to the culmination of what I think had been bubbling away at the surface for many years about a general spite towards these perceived elites. This is a picture of Gordon Brown, who was prime minister in the early 2010s. And he was on the campaign trail, and he was accosted by a woman, just an everyday woman living nearby, who wanted to know what he was going to do about all the migrants coming to my area, taking my jobs. All these migrants, what are you going to do? And he tried to have a very calm, rational argument with her and said, migrants are good for economy. Migrants are very hardworking. It takes a lot to leave your country and go to another country, and they add a lot to our local services. And she wasn't having any of it. And he had his microphone on. You can see on his lapel. He has a lapel microphone. And he got back in his taxi, and he made a comment to one of his aides. And he said, that's just such a bigoted woman. And it was still on. His microphone was still on. And it got picked up. And this was used as a catchphrase for months. That bigoted woman. That bigoted woman was not just that woman, but that bigoted woman was millions of people. And the sentiment of that bigoted woman, a lot of people felt, was the sentiment of the perceived haves, or the 1%, or the establishment, or the metropolitan elite, whatever you want to call them, towards the sort of poor, everyday working class. And I think this also teaches us something very important about politics, which is it's never a good idea to ridicule your swing voters. Because the first thing you do in politics is you want to win a campaign. So you say, OK, I need lots of people to vote for me. Who are the people who are definitely not going to vote for me? Forget about them. I'm not going to change their mind. Okay? Who are the people who are definitely going to vote for me no matter what? Great. I don't need to worry about them. They're already on side. The people in the middle, that's the battleground, right? The people in the middle is the battleground. And I think a lot of the people in the middle are the people who are being squeezed. And there has been a feeling of politicians, or perception of a feeling of politicians towards these people, that they are ridiculing them and sort of undermining them and not taking their issues seriously. Which leads me on to a question of whether there is actually a metropolitan elite. This phrase, metropolitan elite, I'm just going to stand up so I can show this in a bit more detail. This phrase, metropolitan elite, was used a lot in the campaign for Brexit. And a lot of people were saying, is this actually true? Is this a perception, or is this a reality? And there was a lot of interesting polling around the attitudes of people who voted to leave the EU and the attitudes of people who voted to remain. And on the left-hand side, this is the result of there's a very prominent pollster in the UK called Lord Ashcroft, and he did a lot of polling around this. On the left-hand side, you have brands that the Leave voters identified most strongly with. On the right-hand side, you have the brands that Remain voters identified most strongly with. On the left-hand side, HP sauce. I don't know actually if Americans will know all of these. HP sauce, you dip your chips in it. You dip your French fries in it. Bisto, it's like a gravy. ITV News is like a slightly right-wing news channel. Health Lottery, Bird's Eye in Iceland are sort of very cheap frozen foods that you put in the freezer and you just have a microwave meal when you get home. PG Tips, Richmond sausages. The Remain voters really like the BBC, Instagram, Spotify, Airbnb, LinkedIn. And the author of the report, the person who wrote up the report from these findings, I'm quoting here from the report, said that the Leave brands are traditional. They are seen as straightforward, they're simple, they're down to earth, good value, and friendly. Interestingly, you'll see that the Leave brands are mostly things. They're tangible, they're physical things, they're products. They're things you can touch, feel, buy, and taste. The Remain brands were seen as progressive, up-to-date, innovative, socially responsible, intelligent, and they're mostly services. And I think that Brexit didn't cause the division in UK society, but I think it did reveal the divisions in British society. And I think it's the same with Trump and Clinton. I don't think that a very divisive campaign where if you voted for Trump, then you almost can't even be respected by a Clinton voter. And if you voted for Clinton, you can't be understood by a Trump voter. I don't think that these sorts of campaigns create these divides, but I think they do reveal them, and they can exacerbate them. And I think that here we see a split in outlooks to life. We have a split in attitudes. The people on the left-hand side are traditional and straightforward, and the people on the right-hand side are sort of up-to-date and innovative and forward-looking. And those are two different opposing, and you might even say conflicting worldviews. This is another really interesting one. I will read this from my screen because I'm not sure it's come out so well. But at the top in the gray box, it says, this is another poll. Do you think each of the following is being a force for good, a force for ill, or a mixed blessing? And on the left-hand side, it says, how did the people who thought the following were a force for ill vote? On the right-hand side, how did the people who thought the following were a force for good vote? And the issues are multiculturalism, liberalism, feminism, the green movement, the internet, immigration. Basically, what you see is people who voted to leave overwhelmingly saw all these things, multiculturalism, feminism, the internet, immigration, as negatives, and vice versa for people who voted to remain. It's so stark that it's almost a complete switch in the blue and the yellow. And I think, again, this shows that I think there are two very strong and distinct worldviews. This, of course, this is a slight oversimplification. There's lots of other gray areas in between. But I think that the Remain and the interesting thing about this debate of the European Union and Brexit was it wasn't just an economic argument. It was actually an argument about worldviews and attitudes to life. And it was, how do you see yourself and how do you see other people? And what are your attitudes to the world? Which leads me on to something else, which is that one of the issues of having a perceived metropolitan elite is that there is an increasing focus as time goes on marginal issues, on political correctness. And the reason I say this is because there's an interesting theory that the issues that people take to define themselves are the issues on the fringe of what is socially acceptable to agree with or disagree with. So, for example, in the UK, at least, I know it's similar across the world, but certainly in the UK, Israel-Palestine is very divisive. Right? There are a lot of people who feel very strongly about Israel, people who feel very strongly about Palestine, and often they butt heads. And whenever there is a flare-up in the Middle East, whether it's a terrorist attack or there's a bombing or whatever it is, or there's a retaliation, people turn out in force to campaign and people get out their billboards and their banners and their megaphones, and people shout very, very strongly and forcefully about, I support Israel or I support Palestine. You have it less so in other issues as well, but Israel-Palestine, I think, is a good example. Why are there so few protests about Syria? Syria, I think, is the sort of carnage of our generation, and it will be a stain on the people who lived through it. And there should be protests outside our government buildings every single day. But I think the reason that there are few protests about Syria is because everybody has just accepted that it's awful, right? And now that everyone agrees, there's no one to disagree with. So people choose the issues on the margins to define themselves. And because of that, the media often take marginal issues to discuss and debate and examine, and whether it's Obama doing a mic drop as a discussion of whether that's cultural appropriation, or pumpkin spice lattes being sort of white privilege, or intersex issues, whether or not transgender people can use men's or women's bathrooms, all those sorts of things. Don't get me wrong, they're important issues, but I think the point is they are important issues for a very small number of people, for people on the margins. And the difficulty with that is that you can have millions of people who only care about bread and butter issues. They are the poor working class who say, that's all very well discussing sort of LGBT and white privilege and cultural appropriation, but I don't have a job. I can't afford food for my kids. And I think one of the backlashes against the elites is this feeling that people only care about these marginal issues that are sort of interesting in theory and important to a few people, but actually these issues are just completely out of touch with what the average Joe on the street actually cares about. And so I think we do focus on the minority at the expense of the majority. And interestingly, when Theresa May, our current prime minister, became Prime Minister last summer, she made a speech where she set out what she was going to do, her crusade for her premiership. And she said, I know that there are a lot of very difficult social issues in our society. We have, if you are white working class, you are much less likely to go to college or university than someone who's middle class or someone who's had access to better tuition. There's lots of different issues. And she said, I'm going to basically stand up for the people who've been neglected. Whether she's actually doing that and whether she will mend this tear in society, I think time will tell. It's too early to see. But I think perhaps the silver lining of something like Brexit, and I say this as someone who felt very strongly that we should have stayed in, and I'm happy to say that because that was my feeling, but I think one of the silver linings and reasons that maybe there were some good parts in it is that it actually held up a mirror to how we're doing. And it showed us that there are these millions of people who've been neglected. And for every person who voted in, who said, oh, you've got to be stupid and racist to have voted out, I think that is an oversimplification because you're sort of rejecting the voting power of 17 million people. Similarly, in the US, anyone who is a sort of liberal Democrat who said, well, you've just got to be racist and backward to vote for Trump, again, you are neglecting the autonomy of millions of people who actually may have really lost out in the economy. And I think that we need to recognize that, and we need to address it. A couple more points, because I want to leave a little bit of time for questions at the end. Fairness is really, really, really strong, and people feel it very strongly. And there's been a lot of interesting behavioral psychology experiments into animals' attitudes to fairness, and whether our perception of things that are fair is nature or nurture, whether it's something that we have picked up along the way or if it's an evolved instinct. And it raises the question, how much unfairness can we tolerate? This is just a couple of minutes. I'm getting towards the end, but I just want to play this quick clip.
So a final experiment that I want to mention to you is our fairness study. And so this became a very famous study, and there's now many more, because after we did this about 10 years ago, it became very well known. And we did that originally with capuchin monkeys, and I'm going to show you the first experiment that we did. It has now been done with dogs, and with birds, and with chimpanzees. But with Sarah Brosnan, we started out with capuchin monkeys. So what we did is we put two capuchin monkeys side by side. Again, these animals, they live in a group. They know each other. We take them out of the group, put them in a test chamber. And there's a very simple task that they need to do. And if you give both of them cucumber for the task, the two monkeys side by side, they're perfectly willing to do this 25 times in a row. So cucumber, even though it's really only water in my opinion, but cucumber is perfectly fine for them. Now, if you give the partner grapes, the food preferences of my capuchin monkeys correspond exactly with the prices in the supermarket. And so if you give them grapes, that's a far better food, then you create inequity between them. So that's the experiment we did. Recently, we videotaped it with new monkeys who had never done the task, thinking that maybe they would have a stronger reaction, and that turned out to be right. The one on the left is the monkey who gets cucumber. The one on the right is the one who gets grapes. The one who gets cucumber, note that the first piece of cucumber is perfectly fine. The first piece she eats. Then she sees the other one getting grape, and you will see what happens. So she gives a rock to us, that's the task. And we give her a piece of cucumber, and she eats it. The other one needs to give a rock to us. And that's what she does. And she gets a grape. And she eats it. The other one sees that. She gives a rock to us now, gets again cucumber. She tests the rock now against the wall. She needs to give it to us. And she gets cucumber again. So this is basically the Wall Street protest that you see here.
So I love that video. You should watch the whole TED Talk if you have time. So by the way, that thinking was used by a lot of people when there were the revolutions across the Arab world in 2011. There were all the protests in Tahrir Square in Egypt. People said, actually, Egyptians in 2011 are the best off they've ever been in their lives. Forget better off than their parents or their grandparents. Egyptians in 2011 are the best generation of Egyptians that have ever existed in Egypt. And people said that actually doesn't matter because they're not comparing themselves to their parents' generation or their grandparents' generation. They're comparing themselves to Americans and Brits and Europeans. And they realized that they didn't have free speech, they couldn't have sex before marriage without feeling like a social outcast. And the interesting thing with the monkeys is that when the second monkey is still getting grapes, when the second monkey is still getting cucumber, the first monkey is still happy to get cucumber. He only gets fed up having the cucumber when he sees the second person having something that he doesn't have. And I think that tells us something very interesting about the world and the way that we think about happiness. I'm just going to draw towards an end with, I think, the last principle, which is the power of the status quo that I mentioned before. In blue on the left-hand side, you have Leave voters. In the yellow, you have Remain voters. And it's broken down by age category. And something that's interesting here is that the In campaign said they had an advantage because they were playing with the status quo. But the difficulty is that because, as I said at the very beginning, the UK joined the EU in the 1970s, if you were born in the 50s, or 40s, 50s, or 60s, then the status quo is not being in the EU. It's being out of the EU, right? So for anyone who is in this later age bracket, and you see the older we go, the more likely you are to have voted Leave, people who are 50s, 60s, and 70s, and 80s, the good old days, the olden days that they remember, the status quo is not being in the EU. For anyone who is born in the 80s or 90s, as my generation, we see being in the EU as the status quo, because that's all we've ever known. So yes, the status quo is very powerful and has an influence on people's behavior, but the status quo is different for different people. And depending on how old you are, that has an effect on how you voted. And there's also a lot of behavioral psychology that has borne this out, that generally we stick to the status quo. It's the same reason that most people have never changed the factory settings on their iPhone, or that when you go into a room, you don't rearrange the furniture because you like the way it looks when you just walked in. The thing that we inherit or see for the first time, that's the status quo, and we kind of like that. And it takes a lot of effort in order to try to overturn that. One last point is, I think this is the seventh principle, is the importance of anchoring. Anchoring sets the parameters of the debate. Anyone who's been in pay negotiations when you're trying to ask your boss to increase your salary will know, or anyone who's haggled in a market will know, that you go into a market and you say, they say £100, and you say, well, I'll give you £20, and they say, okay, no, 60, and then 30, and then you end up somewhere in the middle. But if they say £100 and you say, okay, what about 80, then you settle for 90, right? So the anchor is the figure or the issue that you say that defines the parameters of the debate. And if you put a strong anchor in, that can shift the whole tone of the debate. And one of the strong messages of the Leave campaign, again, this is Boris Johnson, one of the strong messages of the Leave campaign was, we send the EU £350 million a week. Let's fund our NHS instead, our National Health Service. And not only, again, do I think that was a sort of System 1 message, but in every debate, that figure was debated back and forth. And all the people who were the economists and the bankers and the people who are on the in-campaign side said, that's actually a load of crap. It's not true at all. It's much less than 350 million. We get a rebate, and so that takes off 100 and something million. And then actually, it's an investment, and it's not a cost. But the issue was that that set the frame of the debate, because in every TV debate, when you had two people, you started off debating this figure, and that pulled the debate towards the figure, and you're actually on the battleground of the people who talked about that figure in the first place. In other words, the Leave campaign. And it hijacked the conversation. And I think, again, I'm not sure if it was conscious or subconscious, but these principles of behavioral psychology were used very effectively. So to conclude, I just want to think about where we could go from here, because this is a bit of a cliche, but it's not the end, it's just the beginning, right? The vote to leave the EU was not the end of a process, it was a vote for what the future will look like. And when we trigger Article 50, we are about to enter 2 years of negotiations with the European Union, which is going to set the parameters of what the UK will look like for certainly the next generation, if not the next 100 years, and probably beyond that as well. And so 3 things that I will mention that I would advise anyone who is negotiating the UK's position with the EU, if there are any EU negotiators in here. First of all, blackmail and ultimatums are very unwise. I think we saw that with the ultimatum game, that when people try to push you into a corner and force your hand and say, you know, you need to take this because otherwise you're going to get nothing, people often feel spiteful towards you. And so the UK trying to say to people, there was a debate recently that people said that the UK has really, really good intelligence networks, and we have sort of phone tapping, and we have GCHQ, and we have helped prevent lots of terrorist attacks across Europe. And so people were saying that the UK could say, well, you'd better not give us a bad deal, because otherwise we're not going to share our intelligence with you anymore. That's basically trying to blackmail people, and I think that would be very unwise, and that you'll get a backlash because of that. Number 2, there's an issue of trying to punish the UK as a deterrent. So as I mentioned, we have French elections this year, and there's sort of populist politics in the Netherlands as well, and also increasingly in Germany, that there is a clash of 2 sides. On the one hand, you have the UK trying to get the best deal possible. But on the other hand, the European Union is very scared because they know that if the UK gets a good deal, that might just set a precedent for all the other European countries who think, we don't want to take all these migrants. Let's pull out of the European Union and we can get a good deal just like the UK, right? And so there's going to be a clash between the UK trying to get a good deal and the EU trying to either punish or be seen to punish the UK as a deterrent to other countries. And thirdly, going back to loss aversion, one of the really difficult things that is going to play out, this is my prediction, one of the really difficult things that's going to play out in the next 2 years of negotiations is when you negotiate, you have give and take, right? You have, these are the things that I have, and those are the things that I want to get, and I need to relinquish some of these things in order to get some of those other things. So, for example, the UK might have a very expensive contract to buy car parts from Germany, right? And we don't have such a contract to export let's say, microchips to China, right? The contract with China might be, the deal with China might be worth a huge amount, but because we already have the one with Germany and the one with China is not sorted yet, then we might be unfairly biased towards what we already have, and we might basically put ourselves on the back foot because we are unjustly favoring what we already have at the expense of what we actually could get. So we have loss aversion rather than trying to play our hand to get a potential gain. So those are 7 principles that I think we can use to understand Brexit. And I think Brexit is a case study partly for what's happened in the US and also what might happen across the EU in the next couple of years. And I think there's a lot of lessons in here, and I think that we should pay a lot of attention to them. So AMA, ask me anything. I think we have a few minutes for questions. Yeah, I guess go to the microphone or hands up or whatever. But thank you very much.
So thank you very much for this very interesting talk. I'm actually one of the people who's from the Netherlands. So as you know, we have our elections today.
Yeah.
And as you probably also know, is that we have a very different political system. So we won't have an outcome as the UK had or as the US has. So the right-wing party will probably not be able to rule and make up for anything that they've promised during their elections. Mm-hmm. Based on the things that you're referencing to in your talk, how do you think that will impact what will happen in our country, for instance, with the unhappy minority? So I don't know a huge amount about the insides of Dutch politics, but I think that a lot of these principles are universal. And we like to think, because there has been a strong sense of nationalist identity in the last sort of 100 years after the Industrial Revolution, that we might think that
British attitudes are different to Dutch attitudes, which are different to French attitudes. Yes, we are different, but we are also, human psychology is pretty much universal. And if you feel like you are being neglected or mocked or not taken seriously by your politicians, then you will try to backlash against them, even if it means cutting off your nose to spite your face. So I think that will be an element in what's going to happen in
So do you
the
think then,
Netherlands.
because nobody wants to rule with the right-wing party, so they're not going to rule, so we'll have a coalition of 5 parties probably
Yeah, I
after
think that
tomorrow?
could happen. And the right-wing party will pull
So
everything
will they then
towards
be
them.
bigger, bigger, bigger until they make 76 seats in parliament and then will be the biggest and be able to rule by themselves? Is that your expectation, or?
I don't know. I don't know. It could be. I think either it could. So in the UK, we had a political party that sort of 10 years ago people thought was going to do very well, called the BNP, the British Nationalist Party, and it was sort of a more right-wing version of UKIP. And there was a lot of fear that they were going to get lots of seats in the parliament, and they were sort of very anti-immigration and believed in sort of white supremacy. And they just sort of like died a death, and no one really takes them seriously anymore. On the other hand, you have a party like UKIP that has done very well and has sort of become more mainstream. So I think it's sort of anyone's guess, but it could go either way. You could either have right-wing parties pulling everything towards them, which is the anchoring effect, or you could just sort of have them have a little spike in momentum and then die off.
Okay, yeah. Thank you.
Hello. My question is, how do you see the role of AI in politics? Specifically, I'm talking about a company called Cambridge Analytica,
Yeah.
which was instrumental in both Brexit and the Trump campaign, and looks as though it will become involved in the French election.
Yeah.
How important is this going to be?
2 minutes. Okay. I will speed through some answers because I think we need to clear the room. So there's a super fascinating guy who everyone should look up called Dominic Cummings, who's very, very divisive, and he basically ran the Leave campaign. And if you just search Dominic Cummings' blog, then you can find all his writings online. He's a sort of very divisive character, kind of Machiavellian, and rubs a lot of people up the wrong way. But he's really interesting, and he writes a lot on his blog about how they went to see loads of ad agencies, and he felt that the ad agencies thought that they were geniuses and everyone else was an idiot, and that they didn't want to work with the ad agencies. And instead, they hired, for the Leave campaign, they hired mathematicians, machine learning experts, AI PhDs, and they used all their funding towards very, very targeted, data-driven Facebook advertising. And I think the role of AI is in politics will cause something that has already started to happen, which is just more tailored political campaigning. So I know that you are a middle-aged man living in this region, married with 2 kids, so I will craft a very specific political campaign that caters to you, and AI will learn whether or not that caters to you and adjust accordingly. That's how I see it.
Okay, thank you.
So I'm curious to know if there is any information around the nuances of when System 1 activates versus System 2, because there's increasing stress globally.
Yeah.
So are we going to see more System 1 thinking, or is it kind of doesn't matter what the context is, System 1 kind of activates?
So System 1 is more engaged when, and there are studies into this, when people are drunk, when they're tired, when they're aroused, either sort of sexually aroused, or if people are in a heightened sense of tension. And that's one of, and there's actually a really interesting study where 2 groups of people were given passages from a really boring textbook to copy out. The first group of people, they had to copy it out for like 5 minutes. The second group of people had to copy it out for half an hour. The people who went through a longer phase of boredom were more likely to have very political right-wing views at the end, or more polarized views at the end. And I think there is some research into your mental state that affects your System 1 and your System 2. In terms of stress globally, I'm not sure whether that's the case, because I think global stress is a metaphor for what's happening in politics, but I'm not sure if people individually are getting more stressed.
Okay, thanks.
So I'd always been taught that conservatism, the definition of conservatism, is aversion to change, support for the status quo. And yet in the Brexit vote, and I'd argue also in the Trump election and in American politics for a while, conservative voters who we would call conservative are voting against the status quo. And I just wonder, do we need to revisit that concept of conservatism, or at least the label we're giving to those voters? I wonder what you thought on that.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think, okay, so in the UK, people have increasingly been saying, and I think this it's not just the UK actually, people have increasingly been saying that our split of politics into left and right is old-fashioned and actually doesn't work anymore. So in the UK we have left liberal and right conservative. It's simplification, but that's basically it, or Democrat Republican. And there's a great Tom Friedman article in the New York Times, which you might have seen, that he speaks about web people versus wall people. And he says that the new divide is not left-right, but it's actually open-closed. It's whether your attitude to society is we should have open borders and be open-looking and look towards the future, or we should look backwards and have closed borders and look towards the past. And so to your point about conservatism, I think that there is an erosion of these traditional political definitions more toward, and I think we probably need a new way of looking at politics. It's just a completely different spectrum. And we've inherited these systems, but we maybe need to rethink them.
Thanks.
We're wrapping up? Okay, cool. Sorry, quickly, sure.
Thanks for that. That was great. So I have a question actually about the psychology, the behavioral psychology of lying in this debate, in this discussion, because it seems to me that the willingness to lie in favor of keeping the debate and the discussion and the decision in the system one side seems to be present. I sort of observed that the anchor tenets of the conservative positions were essentially lies but easy to process as system one, and the liberals wanted to debate the truths, right, get into system two debates. Can you talk about lying in this, how we process that?
That's interesting. So there's a guy you should read called Dan Ariely, who is a sort of the main researcher into lying. He actually he has a great documentary on Netflix called, I think it's called The Dishonesty Project, and he wrote a book about this as well. And he does a lot of research into what makes people lie and why we lie and how we tell lies. I'm not sure how lying necessarily factors into system one and system two, but I think that if you hit someone with an emotional message, that is a system one message, whether that's make America great again or take back control, that's system one. People don't necessarily approach it in terms of true or not true. People approach it in terms of, do I identify with that or not? And I think that asking whether or not something is true or not true is a system two thought process.
Yeah, great, thank you.
Thank you. Cool, thank you very much. Sorry?